Well, I'm going to go ahead and officially welcome everyone to our first webinar event of the fall, Shrinking, Gasping, and Disappearing Fish. We're thrilled to have everyone who's attending, and we're very thrilled to have our all-star panel featuring Dr. Pauly, Dr. Jaquette, and Dr. Mallory. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the Yale Sustainable Food Program, the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies, the Yale Animal Law Society, and the Yale Environmental Law Association. Before I introduce our moderator for today, I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about our program, the Law, Ethics, and Animals program, which is a new multidisciplinary program at Yale Law School. We aim to inspire impactful learning and scholarship about the deep questions that are raised by humanity's treatment of and relationship with other animals. We also aim to empower Yale scholars and students to produce positive legal and political change for animals, people, and the environments upon which they depend. This event is part of our One Health speaker series, which explores the inseparability of the planet, animal, and human health. If you like this talk, we're hosting another one next week about the disregard for workers in meatpacking plants during the midst of a pandemic. Go to law.yale.edu/animals and click on events to register for that one and others in the series. Without further ado, I will pass off the microphone to today's moderator, Chris Fuell. Chris is a JD candidate at Yale Law School, a graduate of New York University, one of our LEAP student fellows, and a rising star focused on marine animal exploration, habitat degradation, and human rights abuses. Chris will introduce the topic and today's panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. And again, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this kickoff event of the One Health speaker series, Shrinking, Gasping, and Disappearing Fish. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you again so much to Professor Doug Kaisar, as well as Professor Jonathan Lawborn, who are the two faculty directors of the LEAP program, and to Viveka Morris, who's the executive director, for helping to put on this One Health series. Another big thanks should definitely go to Noah Macy, who's the new program fellow, and is making sure that all of this runs smoothly over Zoom behind the scenes, which is always a really important task in this day and age. I'm really excited to have a conversation with these three wonderful panelists and to help you all in the audience engage with them through your questions during the Q&A. The purpose of this event is to discuss the issues and potential solutions for marine ecosystems that are suffering around the world. Climate change is making the world's oceans hotter. It's killing critical habitats like coral reefs. It's driving marine animals towards the poles. And it's making oceans more acidic and less oxygen rich at a time when fish already face warlike industrial overfishing around the globe, which has been expanding further and further out into the ocean, propped up by government subsidies. Given the pressure on fisheries, there's also a large and growing issue of illegal fishing, with huge quantities of unreported and unregulated catch coming out of the oceans. Overall, increasing human pressures are causing fish to disappear, and fish catches are declining despite increasing fishing effort. Just to get a sense of these numbers that always make me pause, estimates by an organization called Fish Count suggest that currently between 1 and 3 trillion individual fish are commercially caught in wild capture fisheries around the world every year. And that doesn't even include 51 to 167 billion farmed fish that are killed for food every year. Just as a comparison, current estimates are that every year 300 million cows are killed for meat each year and 66 billion chickens are killed each year. And that just shows you the scale at which we've been removing and killing marine life. In terms of impacts on humans, 3 billion people rely on fish as a primary source of protein, and this looming ecological collapse poses profound risk to humanity and the health of both people and animals. We're really in hot water, you could say, but making radical changes now could have an enormous healing impact. So with that overview, I want to try to introduce our panelists, who will each present for 10 minutes, and then we'll save the remaining time for questions. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Pauly. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia and the principal investigator at the Sea Around Us Research Initiative at UBC. He's truly a preeminent fisheries scientist, and he's published critical work on our collective shifting baselines on the state of fish populations and the practice of fishing down the food webs. His work with Sea Around Us has revolutionized fisheries data. It provides one-of-a-kind scientific estimates of both reported and unreported fish catch around the world, beyond what's reported in government statistics, through on-the-ground interviews and analyses. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Jaquette, who is a professor at New York University, and she's my former mentor, supervisor, and my friend. She's really the person who stimulated my passion for this field, so I'm really excited to have her here today. She works on global cooperation dilemmas, including marine conservation and climate change, and she's a champion for corporate accountability, including through her great book on new uses for shame in the modern age. She works to expose how corporate interests shape global institutions and beliefs about science, from the impacts of climate change to animal welfare. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Thomas Mallory, who is a professor at the University of Washington and the founder of the China Ocean Institute. Her work focuses on Chinese global ocean governance and fisheries issues. And China is one of the major and increasingly large players in the fishing industry and a large and growing consumer of seafood. Her work has included detailed analysis of the use of fisheries subsidies in Chinese fisheries and beyond, and their harms to global and domestic sustainability initiatives, as well as other policies and practices surrounding seafood production, consumption, and trade in China. I'm sure this is going to be a great conversation, and please submit questions during the talk to the Q&A function. After the panelists have presented for 10 minutes, I'll do my best to coalesce your questions thematically and make sure that we can get as many of your questions answered as possible. While each of the panelists is talking, we'll have all the other panelists turn off their videos so the person who's talking can screen share. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Dr. Daniel Pauly first. Thanks.
Mute. I will share my screen. So we are going to speak. Do you hear me well? I will present to you the reason why fish have problems when it's hot and when there is less oxygen in the water. Basically, breathing in water is very, very more difficult than breathing in air. We are mammals. We spend all our time breathing, but we don't spend much energy acquiring the oxygen that we need. In the water is very different. A liter or a volume of water contains 30 times less oxygen than a liter of air. Water is more viscose, much more viscose than air. And it is also more dense. So it requires an effort to move the water across gills much more than for us to move air across the lungs. And the diffusion rate of the molecules' movements are 300,000 times slower in water than in air. So oxygen has problem penetrating into the bodies of fish. And for this reason, in the course of evolution, fish which were small and had very small gills 300 or 400 million years ago, here you see one, are very small, with very small gills, have over time become full of gills. The head of a fish is actually full of gills, except for this big fish there from the Amazon, which breathe air, and it will drown if prevented from reaching the surface. So gills are big, and they occupy the whole head, but they are really a surface. And a surface, you see, this is not a fish actually, but you see, engine need to be cooled, right? And in all cars, there is a reservoir in the front. Radiator in the front, and radiators have, in this case, hot water gets in front from the engine. It goes through lamellae, and the air picks up the heat, and the hot water, the cool water goes back to the engine. And this lamellae, they are the site where the exchange takes place, where the heat is picked up by the air. Now, gills function exactly that way, but gills, like a radiator, can grow in only 2 dimensions. see, if you put a radiator behind a radiator, it doesn't help, because the air is already hot when it reaches the end of the when it has crossed the lamellae, so it wouldn't help. So a radiator can increase in size only in width and in height, but not in depth, in 2 dimensions. And this is exactly the same thing with gills. When water hits gills, it gives up the oxygen, and it comes out as deoxygenated water at the other end. So it would make no sense to have another layer of lamellae behind. So it functions as would a radiator in 2 dimensions. But the bodies that have been that must be supplied with oxygen, they grow in 3 dimensions: the height, the width, and the depth. So you have a situation where a fish, look at A, figure A, a fish, as it gets bigger, has less and less gill area per unit weight. This is something that the fish cannot avoid. It has less oxygen supplying surface, but more body. So basically, there is a point at which a growing fish will barely meet its oxygen requirement. And it will not grow beyond that, because beyond that, the oxygen delivered to the body would not be sufficient. And let's call the rate of oxygen consumption at this rate maintenance. It can maintain itself, but cannot grow beyond that. If you have any factor that causes this metabolism, that causes this oxygen requirement to increase, then the fish have to become smaller. This oxygen consumption is a function of temperature. So when a fish, contrary to us, we have the same temperature, except when you have fever or when we die, our temperature is always 37 centigrade. Don't ask me about Fahrenheit. But a fish, its temperature varies with the water temperature. So if the temperature is elevated, it requires more oxygen to maintain itself. On the other hand, at the same time, in warmer water, there is always less oxygen, even when the water is not deoxygenated. So the problem becomes big, and the fish become smaller. So that is the principle why fish get smaller when the temperature increases. And we have in 2013 we wrote a big report about that, and there were people against it. There was always people against something, but it established this principle, and there are lots of empirical observation to back it up. And another thing that we established that was established on a global basis, fish cannot really adapt to changing temperatures because it makes them smaller, among other things. So what they like is move when the temperature get bad, move to areas where the temperature is the same as before. That is, they don't move to areas where the water is cooler. They move to areas where the water is the same temperature that they had before. So as they do that, they essentially leave the tropics. In the US, for example, you have in New York fish that were before in Florida, and in British Columbia, where I lived, we have fish that were before in California. This is happening. The fauna is changing, but in the tropics, you don't have an exchange of fauna. The fish are leaving, and none are replacing that. And so this figure that you see in the moment it was the first of its kind, and it was used by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to illustrate what will happen in the ocean. And there is another way to show what this changes and this movement, and it was discovered in 2013. It is something called a mean temperature of the catch. You see, the fish have, actually all animals can change certain attributes like the color of their skin, or the length of their leg and something, that a few genes can mutate and change something very easily, some external things. But internally, the temperature at which enzyme best work, the various enzyme, it's very difficult to change, because an enzyme that works at 15 degrees temperature Celsius cannot work with another enzyme that works at 20 degrees or 30. So basically, you would have to change the temperature of all the enzyme at the same time, which you can't, and so evolution is slowed down. The preferred temperature are very constant. So for a species, you can identify the preferred temperature, you can identify the preferred temperature of each species and weight a mean temperature by the quantity of fish of given species, and you get something called the mean temperature of the catch. And I'm almost done. If you compute the mean temperature of the catch for temperate and subtropical climate, for example, from Florida to New York State, you have a situation where the mean temperature of the catch, in other words, the composition of the fisheries catches, will indicate a change in species composition that corresponds to the increase in temperature of the water. The lines are nearly parallel. In the tropics, however, the mean temperature of the water increased since the 70s, but the mean temperature of the catch cannot increase, because once the subtropical fish have left that lived in the tropical fish leave, but the one that remain are only tropical fish. There is no hypertropical fish. So the mean temperature of the catch remains the same, and that the only thing that can change is how many fish you have. And that is my last slide. The summary of all this, you have in a temperate water and in subtropical water, you had in the 70s fish with cold affinities and some subtropical and tropical fish, say on the US East Coast. In the 2000, that situation has changed. Lots fish with cold water affinities have left. They moved to Canada, and fish from the Bahamas and Florida have moved up. And in the future, there will be only tropical fish, left. And but in tropical areas, you still see my screen? Because I don't see it. Anyway, in the tropical areas, you start with tropical fish, obviously, and a few subtropical fish. Now they are getting warmer. The subtropical fish have left, and in the future, all you have is you're going to have fewer fish, and that is the situation. And I thank you very much. My colleagues will probably talk about the oxygenation that happens worldwide, and that adds to the problem that temperature causes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pauly, for that very apt description of why this title, Shrinking, Gasping, and Disappearing Fish, is really an apt and proper title for what's happening to marine life. Next, we're going to have Dr. Jennifer Jaquette, and I'm going to turn over to her. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, thank you so much. I love the Yale LEAP program. I'm honored to be here, and I'm really honored to be sandwiched in the middle of my PhD supervisor, Daniel Pauly, and my former undergraduate student, Chris Fuell. I feel way too young for this whole scenario, but apparently I'm not at all. And Chris himself is very accomplished in this area. He's already published 2 papers, and he has a really excellent paper about the lack of protections for fisheries observers, which really gets into that human rights issues that were discussed in the introduction. And so I highly encourage you to seek that out. So I'm in Vancouver at the moment, actually, and I've been getting to see Daniel every week. And we've been talking a lot about the transition between, you know, he was introduced as a fisheries scientist, but actually you can even tell from his talk, he's not really a fisheries scientist, he is a fish scientist. He knows a lot about fisheries, but he also knows a lot about fish, and a lot about them physiologically, a lot about them in terms of as animals. And I think that's really important, and it situates him to be sort of more avant-garde than a lot of traditional fisheries scientists in this moment. So I mentioned this generational thing, not as a glib or conversational aspect, but as a framing for my talk, which is a little bit, I mean, I'm going to introduce this big view that I think is happening within the field of fisheries science, and then just highlight 3 little pieces of this. So fisheries science, which you know, is now over 100 years old and well established in certain universities, certainly Tabitha's, certainly University of British Columbia, has a certain kind of lens, of course, through which it sees the oceans, how the science is done, and who really the field serves. And fisheries science, it's no big secret, is really an extension of the fishing industry. I think we're in a major paradigm shift at the moment, where we're moving towards something, I haven't come up with the best title yet, so I just called it Marine Animal System Studies. But I'd say that's what Daniel Pauly has helped push fisheries into, a new way of looking at the world, and especially at fisheries, where this is more of a global analysis, where you view it as a system, fisheries as a system, the way we view climate as a system. Highly interdisciplinary. It's no longer just open to biologists and modelers. We have law students, second-year law students working in fisheries, and people, ethnographers working in fisheries. The whole field, I think, is opening up to everyone, and that is going to be a very good thing, especially for fish, because fisheries science has looked at fish and invertebrates as seafood, as resources, as protein to feed the world. And I think this new way of looking at marine animal system studies requires us to think about them as individuals, species, wild animals, and all these different things. This slide will come back up again, so I'm not going to go through it bit by bit, but I just want to highlight 3 things here. So the first is this aspect of how we see fish and invertebrates. And when I was called up by this wonderful reporter who's now left the New York Times, unfortunately, about how climate change is reshaping Iceland fisheries, I thought, you know, really I should just have her talk to Daniel, because you can tell from his presentation, he knows more than almost anyone on this subject, certainly much more than I do. But as I told her, I said, you know, you should really just talk to Daniel Pauly, but there's one thing I'll say that maybe he won't, which is the experience of the fish themselves. So, I mean, Daniel knows this well, but I'm part of the NYU program. We have an animal studies program. We are often thinking, okay, I wonder about this experience from the aspect of the individual fish. And so I gave her a couple lines about how the fish were experiencing this shift, that it wasn't just about fisheries and a fight for resources, but the fish are actually moving to breathe. And if we fail to appreciate that, we're failing in a way, again, to capture the entire experience, this major shift that the animals are going through as well. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about this, about the role of pain and how much we think about deoxygenation and the experience of pain in fish, very understudied area. But I just want to emphasize, this is one area where I think I can contribute a little bit in this direction, even without being as trained in the physiology, is to just push, you know, reporters or students to also consider the lives of animals. And in that vein also of viewing fisheries primarily as commodities or resources, I wanted to mention another paper that we recently published, which challenged, I mean, I tend to do almost all my work in this way by finding arguments that I'm not really persuaded by and digging in on them empirically. And this is CAMLAR, the organization that oversees fisheries in Antarctica, claiming that, you know, the fisheries from Antarctica make a valuable contribution to global food security. That's right on their website. It's what a lot of people say about fisheries in general, and even high seas fisheries. And there's a big negotiation going on right now about biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, including in Antarctica. And there were discussions about, well, if we were to close the high seas, or if we were even to protect a big swath of them, that we would be in some way compromising global food security. So my co-authors and I dug in on this question, and the most important thing to highlight is that only 39 species represent almost 100% of the catch from the high seas, the area beyond national jurisdiction, and only one of those species is exclusive to the high seas, meaning you could close down the high seas entirely and there would only be one fish that we would no longer catch, because all of the fish otherwise are shared with also EEZs, those exclusive economic zones off of national territories, which represent about 1/3 of the ocean. And also, when we look at what species are being caught and where they're going, they're being processed in various countries and mainly winding up in the EU and the United States, which suggests that this really isn't a food security issue. This is about luxury markets and markets that are fairly or very well food secure. And to use that kind of argumentation without the rigorous empirical backup is really just, again, playing into the hands of the industry. And speaking of the industry, so fisheries scientists typically think of their work as feeding into the state. So either maybe actual US states, for instance, have their own jurisdictions and they manage really inshore fisheries, or the United States has a federal jurisdiction over, again, their national waters. And we have the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and we require that there are, you know, really strong biological models of fisheries to help manage our fisheries. And then in those high seas areas beyond national jurisdiction, there are these things called regional fisheries management organizations, and they're also required to have a certain amount of science. And so fisheries scientists tend to think, okay, we do the science, we feed it into the managers, and then the managers, you know, set quotas for catches. In, I think, the new paradigm we're moving into, we know, and especially if we think of fisheries the way we think of climate change, we know that's a silly way of conceiving of responsibility, or it's one way of conceiving of it. It's certainly not the only way. And so in this various ways of conceiving of responsibility, we can again turn to climate change, which has traditionally, or I would argue in the 20th century, conceived of emissions as primarily attributed to countries. So we would talk about, oh, the US is the biggest emitter, next is China, India is coming up. And we know that in the 21st century, all of this is breaking down. We, of course, still talk about countrywide emissions, but we have deployed what Doug Kaiser calls our moral imagination to conceive of responsibility in new ways that challenge the individualistic orientation, even the nation state orientation. And I love this term, moral imagination. I assume all of you Yale students have read this paper several times. I think it's incredible. And I think fisheries can learn a lot from what climate change is doing with regard to the moral imagination of conceiving of responsibility. So again, with climate change, we've been talking now about the role of animal agriculture. You know, in 2007, this amazing report said, hey, look, it's really not just the cows, it's the land use change that we are carrying out in the name of the cows. That is a very big shift in our moral imagination of responsibility, to think about the direct and indirect effects of livestock, which really changed the conversation with regards to climate change. Thinking about individual emitters, 1 billion high emitters. What about the highest seafood consumers? And fossil fuel producers, of course. So there's wonderful work that's been done to show who are the largest corporations responsible for fossil fuel extraction and emissions. And of course, many of you have seen these numbers already: Chevron, Exxon, BP coming up. And I've been, following that literature quite closely and thought we could do the same thing for fisheries. So on the high seas, we had this wonderful paper. Daniel is an author on this paper about the top high seas fishing nations and their landed values. So here are the countries in the left-hand column: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Spain, the US. And we've just recently, we have a paper under review asking who fishes on the high seas in terms of corporations. So we were able to use this wonderful new data set from Global Fishing Watch that allows us to identify vessels and their fishing patterns, as well as their gear types. And we actually, Gabby Carmine, who's now a PhD student at Duke University and was also an undergraduate student of mine at NYU, she began working on this with me, did an incredible amount of research into the owners and corporate actors of these fishing vessels. Through all sorts of various ways, but it's a little bit like your personal information. A lot more is online than you'd think, and the same is true for fishing vessels. And so using a variety of techniques, including the vessel registries of RFMOs, she was able to identify about 90% of the effort in terms of ownership of individual owners, and linking about 2/3 of that effort to actual corporate actors. Now, why is this important? Because now we can conceive of responsibility in a little bit of a different way on the high seas. And this shows you the corporate actors that we've identified by gear type. And you can see that drifting long lines is our biggest question mark. We don't know how the corporate actor identity of a lot of longliners out there. And these are just the top 10 corporations responsible for fishing on the high seas and their headquarter countries. Not super surprising, but you can see one American company is up there in the top 10. And what's interesting is several of these, the Saho Group, Dongwon, they are publicly traded. And this gives us, again, new ways of conceiving not only of responsibility, but of social change. So should we want to engage shareholders in this conversation, or engage student investment and divestment movements in this conversation? It gives us new ways of looking at this problem. Finally, I just want to end on this final question down here of cellular seafood, because I think a lot of people in the Yale LEAP program will be following this issue of cellular animal agriculture in general. So the idea that you can just grow through a cell line the flesh of animals in the lab. And I will say that in general, fisheries scientists, I haven't engaged on cellular seafood much, but but I would guess that their position would be that this is a third option. We have capture fisheries, we have aquaculture, and then we'll have this third option of cellular seafood for the truly eco-conscious among us. And in my view of marine animal system science, which also has the view that we need to drastically curtail fishing effort, we really need cellular seafood to be a true substitution for capture fisheries or for aquaculture, for it to deliver on any promises it's making about sustainability. So again, another undergraduate student and I, Luke Stuntz, are working on a paper, it's almost submitted, on the risks and opportunities in cellular seafood production. And right now there are only about 5 working cellular seafood companies. 3 of those are based in the US, the 2 others are in Asia. And you can see the species that they're going for here. They're really new opportunities. But the thing I want to just end on and caution against is cellular seafood, first of all, is not going to be more sustainable than a plant-based diet in terms of the food system. So given that it will have higher energy and other resource consumption costs compared to plant-based, we really, again, want to see this be a substitute for capture fisheries or aquaculture for it to deliver on its promises. Now, aquaculture is, so, we have cellular meatballs, we have cellular steaks, we're gonna have cellular eggs. What makes cellular seafood so interesting is that we actually have already an analog that we can look at, which is aquaculture. So if you remember, or if you've read about it, as I have 30 years ago or 40 years ago, aquaculture saying much the same thing. we're going to replace capture fisheries. We're going to solve the problem of overfishing using aquaculture. Well, now we have enough data to ask whether or not that happened. And there's been another paper that analyzed this as well in conservation biology, but we dug into some specific species group. Here you see salmon and shrimp. You can see aquaculture in the red, and that's aquaculture production, and then all the wild catches in the blue. And it's pretty obvious just to your trained eye, there's no genuine relationship, right? Aquaculture is growing drastically. The wild catch is also growing in some cases for salmon, and it hasn't been displaced. What's happened is the price of salmon has gone down, and in fact, a lot of fishermen feel they need to catch more salmon than ever to make up that price difference. So aquaculture, the evidence from aquaculture suggests that this is not going to happen alone. Cellular seafood could be a true substitute for capture fisheries or even for aquaculture, but through a free market approach, the way that aquaculture has had a free market approach, we caution against that idea just happening on its own in the marketplace. Now, that's not to say that governments could not play a role in helping, orchestrate that substitution. And most importantly, I think that cellular seafood has been wonderful in terms of enabling an argument to actually end industrial fishing altogether, because now there will be a true substitute product. But if you're interested in that work, I hope it will be coming out soon. I thought it seemed in line with the LEAP mandate. So I just want to acknowledge the wonderful students actually that were first author on all of this work. And thank you for inviting me today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jaquette. Now I'm going to turn over to Dr. Thomas Mallory for our final presentation before the Q&A.
Great. Good afternoon. Let me just share my slides. Okay. So I want to thank Yale Law School for having me, to Chris and Noah for organizing this. And it's an honor to be on this panel with two other panelists whose work I greatly admire. And I'm in Seattle, so just south of the border, and it kind of right now feels like worlds away for on a number of different fronts. I really appreciate the remarks that Jennifer said about the diverse approaches to fisheries, and certainly Daniel Pauly's work has advanced this interdisciplinary approach. And that's certainly been the case with me. My background is international studies and Mandarin Chinese. Those were my undergraduate majors. So I didn't come to the study of fisheries until my PhD, and was fishing around for a topic and thought, there hasn't been a lot of work done on fisheries. So I essentially just read a lot of material in Chinese about fisheries and try to understand their policy. And so today I'm going to talk about China's role in global fisheries management. I will not talk as much directly about climate change, but it's important to keep in mind that climate change is going to exacerbate all of these issues. It's destroying marine habitats, it's destroying the food chain, and so unsustainable fishing practices is just going to combined with climate change make the situation worse. So I'm going to give an overview of China's distant water fishing industry, and then I'll talk about a few key issues that I see as being areas where we can improve fisheries management. So let me quickly define what distant water fishing is. It refers to fishing on the high seas, which belong to no country, and then in the exclusive economic zones of other countries. So if you look at the little map that I put on this slide, the high seas is the darker blue and the EEZs are in the light blue. China also has a huge domestic fishing industry, but it's better regulated than the distant water fishing industry because the impact of poor fisheries management is more directly felt. And plus it's just closer to home, so it's easier to monitor. China considers fishing in the South China Sea to be part of its domestic fishing industry. And so the fisheries management issues there are really complicated by the fact that there's a bunch of maritime claims. The South China Sea is definitely going to be a place where climate change makes the marine habitat worse and is going to change the composition of the fisheries there. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A if people are interested, but I'm going to mostly focus on the global fleet. There are a number of concerns about China's distant water fishing industry and its impacts around the world, starting with the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of foreign fleets in host countries. There's much less of an incentive to fish sustainably in those places because the fleet can just leave once the resources are exhausted. And also the foreign fleets can displace the local fishermen. In terms of governance, that's also a challenge because there's very little transparency in the bilateral fisheries access agreements that set up these arrangements. So in recent years, China has moved because China recognizes some of these issues, there's been some pushback from the host countries about some of these negative impacts. And so China has started to shift towards targeting the high seas for its fishing activities. So I was, paying attention to Jennifer's points about the high seas and the number of the top 10 corporations that are Chinese. That's no coincidence. In the past few years, China has definitely had a policy that's pushing its fleets onto the high seas because they're less regulated. It was mentioned previously that there are a bunch of regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs, that govern certain parts of the high seas, but there's not actually a comprehensive management system that covers the whole high seas. So there's lots of gaps. And then in terms of the fish bases and ports, that's also a concern as China starts to build up its fisheries supply chain from the point of capture to the market. A lot of these concerns are deepening. So there's also some concerns about the political influence on these host countries through economic, either incentives or coercion, because a lot of countries might not want to speak up about some of these issues because they don't want to jeopardize the economic benefits that they have with China. And then of course there are human rights concerns about the crew, them being poorly trained. A lot of the crew on Chinese ships now are coming from inland China, so they haven't actually had much experience on the ocean, and they might not be paid well or at all, and are mistreated. Some of these people are at sea for several years at a time. So China's distant water fishing industry started in 1985, so it was much later than a lot of the other major distant water entities, so including USSR, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Spain, which began operating in the 1950s and 60s. So China in many ways has been kind of trying to catch up with these other countries, and its policies have been very expansionary over the past few decades, to the point now where now it has the largest fleet in the world. But there have been some positive developments in the last few years. We began to see some changes to this expansionary policy starting around 2014. There's a launch of new training requirements, followed by a more robust observer program. In 2017, I think a lot of this made it into the news, there was a cap announced on the number of distant water fishing vessels for the Chinese fleet, although the cap does not include total capacity. So the ships have actually been increasing in size, if not number. And then earlier this year, the government significantly updated its 2003 distant water fishing regulations to include, for the first time, language on IUU fishing, and also a bunch of other regulations, for example, on vessel reflagging, the establishment of joint ventures with other countries, and so on. In just the past few months, there have been new measures announced that require reporting of transshipment on the high seas. So when fishing vessels transfer their catch to reefers, transport vessels that bring it into ports, and that's often an entry for IUU fish because it's not tracked very carefully. And so that goes into effect next year. And then also just recently, China announced 2 high seas moratoria for the first time. Kind of small, but it's significant because it's the first time they've done that. There are still a lot of remaining issues, and we definitely need to see how all of this will be implemented and enforced. That's definitely really important. And often China is acting in accordance with the letter of the law, not necessarily with the spirit of the law. And so we can see on the next slide here an example of that. This is that huge fleet of hundreds of Chinese fishing vessels that are perched right outside of the EEZ around the Galapagos Islands. And then here are a few of those vessels that are there right now. Lots of different types of gear targeting different species from tuna to squid. So at the same time, it's important to recognize the positive steps and not to demonize China. All countries have had these challenges with sustainable fisheries management. So, it's important to remember that, these really are global issues that require the participation of all countries. So it's not just China, even though I'm highlighting China a lot here. So I'll turn to some areas now where we can have some improvement, just areas that still need to be worked on. One of them, which has been alluded to, is subsidies. So China is the world's largest fisheries subsidizer. It provides an estimated 27% of global harmful subsidies in 2018. China has pledged to remove some of those harmful subsidies over the past few years, but as it's made this pledge, its transparency in reporting the subsidies has also decreased at the same time. So to kind of illustrate this, on the left hand of this slide, I have a shot of the 2009 Fisheries Yearbook, which is where a lot of this subsidies data is reported. And China used to report over, so it's like over half the page, it's indicated by those green brackets, over half a page of subsidies data. So really broken down, by all the different programs. But if you compare that to what was reported in 2018, which is on the right, it's only that little paragraph at the bottom of that page indicated by that green bracket. Right now, there are negotiations going on at the WTO to get an agreement to discipline fishery subsidies. And one of the really big issues they're going to confront is actually, in addition to high seas fishing, Canada has a proposal to address subsidies on the high seas. But one of the other big issues where there's going to be possibly some conflict is that China is seeking special and differentiated treatment as a developing country. So essentially allowing it to fish more, even though it has the world's largest fleet. Another really important issue is seafood trade and traceability. Traceability is an important way to stop the entry of IUU fish into the seafood supply chain. And this is important because China plays such a big role, not just as a harvester of seafood, but also in the seafood trade. So they import over 5 million tons of seafood every year and export over 4 million tons. And a lot of that trade is for the processing industry. So for example, the US sends whole fish over to China to be processed and then will re-import fillets and fish sticks. But there's not a lot of granularity in this trade data. So we don't know how much of those imports are landing on the consumer market in China versus how much is going to the processing industry and then being re-exported. Another issue is that a lot of that fish is labeled as a product of China when it may be harvested by another country. So there's definitely a window here where IUU catch can enter that supply chain and be laundered through this process. There is a traceability framework for seafood that's gaining global acceptance to stop IUU fishing from entering the supply chain. Essentially, this framework identifies what's known as critical tracking events, where fish changes hands, along with the key data elements that are required at those tracking events in order to maintain the traceability across the supply chain. So you can see the little graphic at the bottom of this slide. You essentially have to trace fish from the point of harvest, whether or not there's any bycatch, through any possible transshipment, to landing in a port, and then to the processing stage, and finally to distribution on the market. So if you look at China's traceability system, they are currently working on developing a traceability system, but their standards are still voluntary. And so there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done if you look at China through this framework. So these slides show that some, especially for the harvest critical tracking event, there are some key data elements that that China has in place. But if you look at some of these other stages, for bycatch, transshipment, landing, the critical data elements are not in place for any of these. Here's the last few stages: processing and distribution. So in some cases, there are provinces that require this data, and there are a bunch of pilot projects that are working on requiring this data. And in other cases, sometimes the information, there's some information that's required, but it doesn't meet the global standards. So it's kind of a bit of like a mixed match. But at the national level, there is not a standardized system that requires all of this data. So that's definitely something that needs more work. And then, so this is a very text heavy slide, so don't worry about having to digest all this text. I'm just putting it up for the purpose of illustration. Another issue is the customs codes, or the HS codes. So these are standardized to 6 digits at the international level, but countries can add 2 more digits, so that it just creates a lot of variation across countries. And so, oh, and then another issue too is that a lot of the fish for these custom codes is just kind of lumped together in generic categories. And they're not, these codes aren't necessarily standardized to the genus or species level. And so what this illustrates here, this slide, is comparing the Chinese customs codes for salmon to, which is on the left, to the US customs codes for salmon. And as you can see, so this is the first slide, you know, there's China's list of codes, and then there's the US list, and then here's the second slide, the US list just keeps going, and then the third slide. So the US has many more detailed categories for salmon. And so this makes it much harder to trace seafood across countries. You know, I'm just showing the US and China here. Obviously, a lot of other countries have even different codes. And then the other issue is that, you know, this is just salmon. There's only about 6 or 7 species of salmon, but when you turn to other species, like for example, squid, there are almost 300 different types of squid species, and about 30 to 40 of those are commercial species. And so in cases like that, it's even more complicated. And you know, this matching these codes is more important. So these are some areas to work on in my view. And then I will end there and just say that, yeah, you know, with climate change as the backdrop to all of this, we definitely have our work cut out for us. And thanks for your attention, and over back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mallory. And I think now we'll have all the panelists turn on their videos again to get to the Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for submitting questions as you go. I wish that we had time to answer all of these. But as a starting out one, once we got the other 2 panelists to turn on the videos. I wanted to situate potentially this talk within the current pandemic, which is probably on a lot of people's minds. And we know that transparency in fisheries, and also just in an understanding of what is happening to marine life offshore, faces so many challenges. How do you see this pandemic playing into those issues, whether because of international negotiations being delayed, or because of actual efforts to know what's going on fishing vessels is being impeded?
The first thing I thought was that the pandemic would have the same effect as a war. The World War I and World War II show, at least for European catches, a drop because men and boats were drafted into the war. In the meantime, I think that it's more granular. I don't know for sure, but I have the impression that the big fleets have continued, especially illegal fishing, because the fleet that employ slaves on board, they don't care about whether they are sick or not. And I think that the ratio of legitimate artisanal fisheries and for example in Europe, to industrial problematic fisheries has shifted toward the problematic fisheries during the crisis. This is a guess, and I will see in the future whether that is true. That's my first impression.
I guess I would just add that, you know, I heard about a lot of cases of lobsters being stuck in Canada because China was no longer importing any wildlife, especially living wildlife. And I think the more we can do, again, to place fisheries, I mean, we're talking about wet markets, place fisheries within that context as well, right? People tend to think of this as bats or pangolins, or I'm not suggesting that the virus originated obviously in a marine species. I've seen no evidence of that, but that all of this is lumped together into the wildlife trade. People tend to think about fisheries and the wildlife trade, but actually fish are wildlife being traded. And so for me, it's been an opportunity again to position fisheries in that way.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, in addition to some of the negative effects of, you know, people's attention just being elsewhere and, you know, detracting from the, you know, monitoring and enforcement capability, you know, especially for coast guards, and that possibly contributing to an increase in IUU fishing. You know, the question of the postponement of a lot of the meetings, you know, for organizations that deal with these issues, I think there's some pros and cons. So I think, you know, with the case of the WTO meetings that were supposed to happen this summer in Kazakhstan, it's decreased some of the momentum of the negotiations, but at the same time, there's more time for the countries to kind of work on their positions. So you could see it as an opportunity to, you know, come out with better deals. And, you know, also China is supposed to host the Convention on Biodiversity meeting this year. That was supposed to be this October, and that's been postponed to next year. And so I just hope that, you know, the participants see these, you know, these postponements as opportunities to, you know, do more and kind of refine their positions.
I would like, if I may, comment on Tabitha's presentation. In the last year, I do lots of interviews for newspapers and stuff, and I've noted from journalists a tendency to now blame China for everything, blame China for everything. And I liked Tabitha's presentation because it showed that China, like other countries, tries to make an effort to control a sector of modern civilization that is very difficult to control. And European countries have not mastered got on top of fisheries. They continue to. This is a largely illegal criminal sector, and to expect it from China is ridiculous, especially because China has problem delegating power to lower instances. So China has a big impact simply because it's big, and lots of people have problems getting used to that because a few decades ago, sorry, the East for Westerners was Russia and the Soviet Union, and China was not there. And China is now reclaiming the historic role that is natural, which is one of the great civilizations of the world. And so, for example, the picture that Tabitha showed of boats that are fishing the line, well, that are fishing the line in the Galapagos. There is right now a group of researchers, colleagues, that are upset about this, and they're going to write a paper about this. And yet fishing the line is an argument that we use to show that marine protection works, because marine protection creates resource abundance that you can fish at the edge. And we use the fact that that fleets are fishing the line to show the efficiency, or the fact to show that marine reserves and marine conservation works. So to complain about the Chinese fleet fishing the line in Galapagos is kind of weird, and yet they are upset while fishing the line is the rule everywhere. And there is a tendency among journalists nowadays, and perhaps also scientists, to accept xenophobia as a base for their interaction with China, and that is very disturbing. And I like Tabitha, who, because she knows Chinese, can get much more into this. But I've written lots of papers about China, and now I'm worried. And I don't participate anymore in papers that are bashing China only, because I don't see the point.
Can I respond to that really quickly? Thank you. There's so much there, and thanks for the comments. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand China's mindset and to understand. I mean, even I was saying just as shorthand China, but China is not just one entity. I mean, it's made up of, even in the government, there's different branches of the government that have different priorities. Then there's the company, and there's, just a lot of challenges for China, and a lot of competing priorities, like the desire to become a great maritime power, as well as, making sure there's food security, and a lot of these, these economic priorities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have a global discussion around this, and that's, Jennifer Jaquette's book on the role of shame. I think, that China has responded to a lot of that. I mean, one of the turning points that has been identified to me by a few different Chinese experts on fisheries is, when the Chinese fishing vessel in 2016 was sunk by the Argentine Coast Guard. The huge amount of attention that was given to that incident was embarrassing for China, and so they've responded to that. And even in the new distant water fishing regulations, you can tell that they've had issues with fishing the line, and they're trying to take steps to improve that, because they mention in the new regulations that their vessels should leave a buffer zone between where they're fishing and that line. They don't specify how big the buffer should be, but so all this stuff makes a difference. And like I said in my presentation too, I think we're all in it together, and China is just following in many cases the model that the Europeans have set, like Daniel just mentioned, as well as the Japanese, the South Koreans. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There's been a few questions in the chat about the alternatives to seafood, either through cellular-based meat and the feasibility of these. I'm also curious, in the kind of land animal meat market, there are all these plant-based alternatives that have come increasingly to markets like Beyond and Impossible. And I'm wondering if each of you, maybe you can start on this, Jennifer, but each of you can comment on the potential for this to be an alternative, and what kind of demand will look like for seafood in the future given these, or whether you're very doubtful that this is going to be a true alternative.
Well, I think my point was I am doubtful, especially through a free market approach, that either plant-based or cellular will be a true substitute without addressing, the role of government, both in terms of subsidies, but also, one of the questioners asked about school provisions, or, any sort of government provisions for prisons, for government institutions and cafeterias. I think there's a way in which this could, both plant-based and cellular, and of course just plants in general, substitute for these products, but not through a free market approach, or at least I have yet to be convinced of that. Also, there was a question about, sort of the energy costs of cellular, but so just to be clear, there is no cellular seafood on the market, of course. This is still all in development, but there are prototypes. People have eaten it. It's very likely in the sashimi market, it looks like there will be an opening. These are it's no surprise either that they're targeting luxury markets, because that's where the cost per unit is highest. And so the idea that this is going to be the answer for food security is also, not on the table. I think that if I was China or Britain or the US, where we're all net importers of seafood, this represents a major opportunity, if you're taking the view of sort of food sovereignty, to make big investments and to, potentially decrease all the environmental, animal, and worker related problems. But I think, again, it will have to come from this high level strategy, and it won't just happen because the companies are sort of saying, like, look at us, we're so great. And it'll be good for there to be some, again, prototypes or market. But I'd like to see the government step in with a vision.
Well, if I'm to say something, I if the stuff were available on the market, I would eat it. That's all I can say. But stuff is not available, and so I don't eat it. I think that in the future, with if things continue as business as usual, with population moving toward 9 and 10 billion, I think that meat will become a luxury product unless we fuck up all our forests and deforest everything. But I think that at this point, if we don't change any of the way we operate, we will have other problems than fixing fisheries in 20, 30 years. I think that the notion that we can continue to fish, to have this energy blown into the atmosphere by millions of boats that we don't need to have, I think if things continue as usual with a free market and big company determining what we do, I think we are moving into catastrophe that where what we think and what fisheries do and what cellular seafood does will become completely irrelevant, because we are talking about rice. The productivity of rice, even of the modern variety of rice, declines with increasing temperature. And it has already been the case. It is already the case that the productivity per hectare declines in rice producing countries. And if rice and other major crops get affected, that is the killer. And fish, nobody gives a hoot about, frankly.
Maybe I'll just add just a couple more things. I mean, I actually know less about the cellular seafood, but I think just to kind of add the point to the other panelists' points, that it's as important to think about what trophic level you're eating at with regard to seafood as it is on land. So if you're eating meat, that meat has eaten like a bunch of plants where you could be directly eating the plants. And it's also true with seafood, both wild capture and aquaculture. So aquaculture, I think there's some potential there to have that kind of supplement the availability of wild capture seafood. But there's some problems there. I mean, there's a whole host of problems there, but one of them is, what are you feeding the farmed fish, the aquaculture species? If they're eating, the so-called trash fish, which is a horrible term, you're doing the same thing. You're just eating at a higher trophic level when you could just be eating, the lower level, on the lower level of the food chain. It's more sustainable that way.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we have a hard stop at 1:30, so we only have time for one more question, unfortunately. But there was a question in the chat about this proposal to close the high seas to fishing, and I think that this might be interesting to hear from each of you, especially because of your comment, Dr. Pauly, about kind of the notion that the Chinese are, or any fishing vessels that are fishing like right on the edge of an EEZ, are still in line with the law. This is how we have viewed sustainability. Like, the EEZ is where you manage your fisheries, but on the high seas you can do whatever you want, and that therefore does not violate our notions of where we cannot fish. So I'm curious just to hear from each of you where you think this policy stands from a Chinese perspective and in general.
Who wants to start? Oh, well, I can start. Very, very simply. I think if we close the high sea to fishing, that lots of people will benefit, and lots of countries would benefit, and none of the major fishing nations would be affected, because the fish, most of the fish that people exploit would in the high seas are actually accessible from the EEZ, and this would be relatively easy to monitor from satellites, and that would be a great solution. And therefore I was part of the people who proposed that with my friend Rashid Sumaila, and this is an idea which may actually develop into something that will be implemented, if only in part. And it sounds weird, but so did the idea of exclusive economic zone when they were initially proposed in the 60s by the South American countries. So I'm done.
Okay, I'll go next, which is to say, of course, the BBNJ negotiations, the fourth meeting was supposed to happen this spring, and it was one of those casualties of COVID, and so has been postponed. And there were some discussions of like what would happen there, whether or not we could even create a mechanism to create MPAs on the high seas. And it's very, I think, disconcerting the amount of progress we've made toward that. But I will say that here you can see, maybe even between Daniel and me, this little bit of a rift in the fishery science versus the sort of new view, which is, and I know Daniel also holds this view, but if we think about protected areas on land, they were not manifestations. They were not banks to protect animals so that they could spill over into exploitation. It was a point of protecting biodiversity and protecting nature. And so I don't like fishing the line in any system. I don't like the Chinese fishing, that photo, that image I don't like it. My moral imagination says, I don't like fishing the line. I didn't love the argument that spillover effect was the reason to have marine protected areas. This is playing into that paradigm of industry running the show. And the truth is we need a lot of stakeholders and people to represent the interests of animals, biodiversity, nature, workers, subsistence fishers, small scale fishers. I don't think we need more industry representation at the table. And so when we talk about closing the high seas, I'm open basically to closing any part of the ocean right now, because basically 99% of the ocean is open to fishing with very small exceptions. And so anything we can do to move the conversation away from the idea that this is just about serving the fishing industry is a positive move. And of course, if we close the high seas, we would also close Antarctica to fishing, which is closed to exploitation of whales, seals, penguins. Why not fish?
So I think it's going to be challenging to close the entire high seas to fishing, because countries like China will oppose something like that. But I do think, the idea of closing high seas areas to fishing is, you could really think of it as an exercise of the precautionary principle. There's so much that we don't know about the high seas that, I can't remember exactly like how many species are discovered, like on average every day in the deep ocean, but there's a lot of potential there for, scientific advancement. There's a lot of conversation right now about, marine genetic resources. So it's not just about the fish. There's, just the biodiversity that's in the ocean, that, we should try to protect before it's gone. And so, so I agree that, I think just political will make it hard to close the entire high seas. But preserving some of those areas and having, more conversations about, also seabed mining and what that's possibly going to do. It's, we'll be seeing all this unfold over the next few years.
Well, just to end on sorry, Chris, but just to say that political will also is a manifestation of society. And we're speaking to lawyers at Yale, the future Supreme Court justices potentially. And this is part of how we change political will, is by changing our moral imagination for responsibility, for protection, everything. So, so I think we have to hope that the lawyers will change the political will too.
Thank you. That's a big ask, but I think that's hopefully what a lot of people in this LEAP program are trying to achieve. And I really just want to say thank you again so much to each of our panelists. This has been a really, really interesting discussion. And I really liked the 3 different approaches you took in your presentations to illustrate this fact that fish are shrinking, gasping, and disappearing. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience. I really wish we could have answered everyone's questions, but I'm so glad that everyone engaged with this topic so enthusiastically. And I think that, these questions deserve to be answered and should be answered and thought about in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing. Tabitha, great to see you in video.
Yeah, great to see you too, Jennifer and Daniel.
Bye, Daniel. Bye, Chris.
Bye. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Right. Bye, everyone.